All right, everyone. According to my clock, it is now 12 o'clock Eastern time. So we're going to get started here, and I'm sure we'll have people jump on as we proceed and go through some of the initial housekeeping things. So I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone. My name's Steve Metzer, and I am a senior planner and ADA compliance specialist with DLZ. And on behalf of DLZ, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the fourth in my series of webinars on various ADA topics. If you have not been able to attend any of our previous webinars, those are available for review on DLZ's YouTube page, which I'll give more information about at the end of today's presentation. Some house cleaning things before we begin. For those of you who are using a computer, you'll probably see somewhere on your screen, probably at the bottom, a window with a couple of important icons. If you happen to be watching this on a mobile device, your controls might be different, but certainly are somewhere on your device. First is closed captioning, which will display my spoken words into visual text if you need that accommodation or are in a loud location. You can turn that on and off simply by clicking on the closed captioning icon. Second is the Q&A icon. If you have a question you'd like me to address at the end of today's presentation, please type it in that box. And it will help if you want me to refer back to a slide to give me the section number that your question pertains to, or the slide number if you are able to write that down. While the webinar is scheduled for about an hour or slightly longer, I will stay on past that time to respond to as many questions as I can, and as long as there are still participants on the webinar. I do ask, however, that you please don't use the chat or raise hand options, as I won't be monitoring those at all today. We have a large number of attendees, and it's just impossible for me to interact as much as I would like to on something like this. The webinar is being recorded, and the video will be provided after it is processed if you'd like to get a copy of that video. And again, it'll be put up on our YouTube page for DLZ. We'll also provide a PDF of any of the presentation slides. So please don't feel like you need to take screenshots. And if you need an accessible version of the slides or an alternate format, we can certainly provide those upon request. So sit back and let's move on. So as noted in the promotional information, today's webinar is going to review the requirements for areas of facilities specifically dedicated to employees per the 2010 ADA standards, including those areas shown on the list on the slide. I'm really going to start at the employee entrance and kind of work my way into and around the inside of various buildings that have these different types of facilities. And if we have time, I'll come back to a short discussion on the parking and some of the limited exterior spaces and doors and signs. But based on some of my dry runs, I'm not going to have time to do that. Note that my emphasis today is going to be on informing you about what those requirements are for those employee spaces and the amenities within them, which are regulated and have specific technical provisions that apply. I'm not necessarily going to go over every single required dimension or measurement in those spaces, especially where it applies to public areas and is identical in those spaces. But really my goal today is to let you know what spaces are regulated and which ones are unique to employee common use areas. And I'm kind of really hoping that some of the items I mentioned will make you think something like, I didn't know we had to do that, rather than how wide does that need to be, or some other similar question that you can obviously look up very easily on your own, or send me a quick email and I can respond within a matter of minutes and give you that information. That's not to say that I won't cover some of the key technical provisions, because that certainly is important. I just might not go into great detail in all cases. The discussion for many of those interior elements today will include presentation on some of the scoping provisions contained in Chapter 2 that I covered in a previous webinar, because those are really, really important to know, not only what is regulated, but when it does apply. And also towards the end here, which I think I will have time for, I'll have a short discussion on prioritizing improvements for your employee accessibility in those specific spaces, and discuss a little bit about reasonable accommodations for those employees. Since we do have a time restriction today for the presentation, I've got to draw a line somewhere, and I'll unfortunately have some limitations on what I can present, but hopefully get some of those things in future presentations. First and foremost, nothing I'm going to be presenting today should be considered legal advice or anything similar to that by anyone here. Everything is being presented is my interpretation based on extensive working knowledge of the standards, discussions and interactions with the Access Board staff, attending a number of presentations by Access Board members and others, including at the National ADA Symposium. So I'm fairly knowledgeable, but this is certainly not legal advice. Also, some of the areas that I'm going to be discussing, you may say that sounds just like my break room or my kitchen, but there's certainly going to be differences. So while it may be similar, it's not certainly direct, and we can't offer any technical advice unless I've actually had an opportunity to personally review photographs of those areas. I'm not going to be covering some of the provisions or exceptions in the standards because there's just so many of them, and I won't be covering anything like structural impracticability and cost disproportionality and equivalent facilitation, some of those big words that come into play about when and where you have the ability to not do certain things because it just isn't able to be practically implemented due to restrictions like elevator shafts or structural walls and those kind of things, but those certainly do apply. We also have an audience from many different states, and the requirements, some of those states are different. They have some of their own standards. I'm not going to be discussing any of those specific state requirements, and I won't be discussing any codes that might apply, like plumbing code, where if you have a non-compliant toilet stall, you can combine 2 stalls to make 1 wheelchair stall. But that certainly is contingent on meeting fixture counts of plumbing codes and some other things that might apply. Last, there's a wide variety of spaces within their facilities, and they're going to be different for each community. Each client that we work for has different facilities, and I may not cover all the requirements for every space and every type of building, with my focus really being on the unique spaces for employees that are regulated that we've encountered in many of our self-evaluation projects. So if you have a different type of space you'd like information about, we can try to answer those today in the Q&A if you type it in that box, or you can reach out to me after the webinar via email or phone, and we'll see what we can do. I'm not going to go into a lot of great detail about some of the technical requirements in many of these spaces where they're identical to requirements for public spaces. I've already done a webinar on public spaces, but I will certainly cover the key items to take note of in most cases. So I have some items placed at the end that I will cover if we have time, which again, I said is very unlikely, specifically parking and exterior routes and signs and doors. But if we do run out of time, as I mentioned, the presentation will be provided in a PDF format, and the information on those slides will be included in that PDF. So you will have those. And I'm intending to do a future webinar, I think, on just signs and doors, because they are often misunderstood very, very widely. If you attended the last webinar, you may recall I covered a number of building blocks from Chapter 3 of the ADA standards, which includes many of the technical requirements that are referenced throughout all the sections in chapters 4 through 10. These so-called building blocks are common to a large number of areas and spaces that I'll be talking about today, and sections in Chapter 3 are referenced throughout all those other chapters. As an example, you see on the graphic on the slide here that section 305, which addresses clear floor spaces, are required at a wide variety and number of amenities, including things like drinking fountains and appliances, dining surfaces, sinks, and others that are shown on this graphic. So clear space requirements do differ for these different amenities in terms of size and where they're required to be provided, and I'll cover those specific instances where they are important. Another important building block that we see in many employee areas as well as public areas are protruding objects, which are addressed in section 307. And by definition, any object that protrudes more than 4 inches between 27 and 80 inches is considered a protruding object and can be a potential hazard, particularly persons with vision loss. Objects like open staircases, as that one shown in the photograph, and some architectural beams are also considered protruding objects and can be a significant hazard if not protected with a cane detectable barrier. And in fact, in the photograph on the left, you can see the shorter gentleman standing underneath that landing of that open stairway. And that really should be protected with a railing or other type of thing to protect it from someone running into it, whether they're visually impaired or not. There's a lot of different things that we see that are protruding objects, and there's a bunch of them listed on the slide here. Probably the most common ones we see are fire extinguishers and fire extinguisher cabinets if they're not recessed into a wall. AED cabinets are popping up all over the place and typically are just thrown on the wall. Wall-mounted televisions in conference rooms and hallways, and drinking fountains, if they're not located in alcove, are all probably some of the most common types of protruding objects we see, as well as mailboxes and shelves and all kinds of other stuff. So oftentimes these objects can be relocated to either a lower height, so the bottom is 27 inches or less to the floor and cane detectable, or they can be located outside of a circulation area, such as in a corner or some type of an alcove. Other protruding objects like building and wall features that I presented for that elevated stairway, open stairway, require placement of some type of permanent cane detectable barrier to protect them. And that could be a railing or something similar for something that's open on both sides, even a drinking fountain, or it could include mounting a railing of some type or trash can or other permanent object below, like a paper towel dispenser in a restroom, which is oftentimes on a wall right within the entryway and is also considered a protruding object. So for those of you watching today who are architects or facility managers or building inspectors, be aware that a lot of these protruding objects are furnishings and fixtures that are not part of your design. You specify that they need to be provided, but sometimes the client just decides that they're going to do this or this or this, and they just end up showing up. So just be aware when you do final walkthroughs and whatnot, that some of these items are going to pop up, and know what is and is not a protruding object. But once you know what you're looking for, you'll be surprised at how many of these you see when you walk through all types of buildings. The last building block I want to cover is section 309, which includes requirements for operable parts, which applies to things like door handles and locks, along with a number of other operable parts of amenities coming up later in the presentation. Operable parts must be usable by one hand. Oftentimes we say, let's use a closed fist test. If I can operate it with a closed fist, someone with arthritis or something like that could operate that door handle or that other operable part. Operable parts that require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist are also not compliant. So things like round doorknobs or round faucet controls, door locks, some vending machines, and some other things just do not have compliant controls. And you can see on the photograph on the bottom right here, a feminine products vending machine in a restroom, which is very common, which requires someone to grasp and pull that knob to dispense the product, which would not be considered a compliant operable part. In addition, all those operable parts also must not exceed 5 pounds of force to operate them. And those are all part of that 309 building block. So again, I'll just slightly mention as we go through some of the areas today and refer back to operable parts or clear spaces or protruding objects. But I won't be going through all the specific requirements for them again, unless it's unique to that space. So let's first review some of the very important and relevant terms I'm going to be using extensively today, so we're all starting on the same page. There's 4 major defined terms to know in section 106.5 definitions that I want to cover. First is common use, which simply is anything not for use by the public and available for the shared use by more than one person. So if you have a space that would be considered common use, like a restroom, but is only for use by one person, like in a private office, that restroom in that private office is not required to be accessible. All other ones certainly would be. Second are circulation paths, which is again pretty self-explanatory. It includes all circulation areas like sidewalks and hallways and corridors, and any routes to move between different floor elevations of multi-story buildings. Employee work areas are defined, but they don't get very specific about what is a defined work area. They really only state some of the areas that are not work areas, like corridors and toilet rooms and kitchenettes and break rooms. And there's a list of items there actually within the definition. And last is restricted entrance, which would include any entrance that's not for use by the public and is not considered a service entrance. So restricted entrances can be controlled a number of different ways, either by a lock or some type of signage that restricts the entrance with employees only. or it could even be the location, such as being accessed only from an employee parking area that the public wouldn't have access to because it's fenced or otherwise controlled. So if you've used the ADA standards, you might also know that any term that's defined in section 106.5 of the standards is shown throughout the standards in italics. And I've put a screenshot of a page out of the ADA Standards Chapter 4 and highlighted all the italicized words, including 3 of our 4 common terms in green highlight that I just went over. So as you see any italicized word in the ADA standards, you can refer back to section 106.5 to see how that space is defined if it is relevant to your question that you might have. So let's start with accessible routes. Again, we're coming into the building either from a common entry with the public or a restricted entrance for employees. And the scoping provisions of accessible routes in section 206 requires that at least one compliant route be provided from building entrances to all the accessible spaces and elements within the facility, including employee common use areas. So I'm going to assume today, for today's purposes, that again, limited detail ability, that we're not having any issues on those accessible routes related to clear widths or slopes or whatnot. And if you are interested in those are pretty easy to review in the technical requirements. One important area of facilities that is often overlooked and incorrectly assumed to not be accessible since they are not public, and the reason I'm doing this presentation today, are some areas open only to employees. There's really a lot of confusion out there on the part of many in both the industry as well as clients about what employee spaces are regulated and what the requirements are for access. Both sections 203.9 and 206.2.8 include provisions for employee work areas, with the provisions of 206.2.8 actually being new to the 2010 standards, and I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. While most employee work areas are exempt from Title II standards, as we've already discussed, there are requirements for compliance of common circulation paths, building emergency egress, and visual fire alarms in shared work areas like a large room with cubicles or desks if the building is wired for updated fire alarms. This requirement includes the ability of all employees to be able to approach, enter, and exit their work area, and also to have a compliant common use circulation path within that space if it's larger than 1,000 square feet. If the work area is less than 1,000 square feet, as shown in the top figure here, it's only required to have an approach to the space and the entry door and exit accessibility. As always, 203 and 206 both include a number of different exceptions, including small work areas that are elevated, circulation paths, part of a work area equipment access, and exterior work areas that are fully exposed to the weather, among others that aren't included on the slide. In addition to have the ability to approach, enter, and exit their work area, as I showed on that last slide for areas under 1,000 square feet, if you have a work area that is larger than 1,000 square feet, you must also have a compliant circulation common use path within the work area. And that is shown here in yellow. So on the bottom of the slide, you can see the entrance with a yellow path to the door, the clear space at the door. And then inside of that workspace, you have yellow areas that are common circulation paths that lead to all the different cubicles and other exit or entry doors to that same 1,000 square foot or larger workspace. These types of spaces could be, again, a office space with cubicles or multiple desks, or it could be like a large machine shop or something where everyone has a station where they're working and would still have the need to be able to circulate among that space if it's larger than 1,000 square feet. So let's look at a simple facility graphically. And this is a colorized floor plan of a facility that we've evaluated recently for a client. And I think it'll help visualize some of the different areas of the facilities that I've just talked about. So for those of you that we've done work for, this is how I use the floor plans or other floor plan layouts that you give me, like this simple evacuation plan, to identify the different areas we need to evaluate for your self-evaluation. This happens to be the first floor of a courthouse in a large city. This building is several stories tall, so there are a lot of other similar spaces on the other floors. But for today's purposes, we'll just use the first floor because it has the entry and exit. So you see in green all the different public areas, which includes the public entrance and the lobby with security screening, elevators and stairs, and the men's and women's public restrooms, as well as the 2 courtrooms and the jury room, which is utilized by jurors. The employee entrance on the top left and all the different circulation paths for employees are shown in pink, with the other work areas that are a mixed employee work area and circulation space shown in purple. So if you recall from the previous slides regarding that 1,000 square foot threshold, the smaller purple area on the top right of this graphic requires only access to the work area at either end, but nothing within the space because it's less than 1,000 square feet. However, that area to the bottom left is well over 1,000 square feet and is actually just a large open room with desks rather than cubicles. So the requirements for that space would be the access to and from it, as shown in the pink, as well as within the space, there are circulation paths to get through and to all those different work areas. There are some exempt areas within this space, which are shown in red, and they include things like janitor's closets and the restrooms for the judges' chambers and whatnot. But most relevant to today are areas shown in orange, which on this floor is only the 2 male and female public employee restrooms that are in that employee corridor. But there could be things like conference rooms and a number of other things which are pretty common, and we see that pretty regularly. So so for this level, there could also be a common use area. The jury room could be orange as well, because the employees do use that as a break room when there's not a court in session. So all the unshaded areas are work areas. So things like the private individual offices and copy rooms and file rooms and areas for service counters and workrooms are not regulated. Although, again, it's certainly a good idea to allow them to be accessible and make them accessible upon a reasonable accommodation request. We find a number of facilities that don't meet the requirements for drinking fountains. The scoping provisions in 211 for drinking fountains note that you must meet the requirements for each building level or within a secured area, which would include employee-only areas with restricted access. So if drinking fountains are provided, you must have at least 2 on each building level or secure area of a building. They don't have to be a matched pair at the same location like shown on the upper photograph, but most of the times they are a matched pair like that. Located in an alcove, so they're not a protruding object. The standards don't provide any guidance at all about travel distance to the different types of fountains, so consider what's reasonable, especially where you have large facilities and the location of the different types of fountains might not be obvious or convenient. An issue that we often see where there are 2 fountains on a floor level is one of the fountains being in a public area and one in a restricted employee area. So that clearly doesn't meet the scoping requirements, since it requires disabled employees to use the public fountain, assuming that it's a different type of fountain. And the public does not have access to the fountain in the restricted area because it's in an employee area. So while best practice now includes providing bottle fillers at many fountains or paired fountains, at least one. They are not an acceptable substitute for either type of fountain, but it does maximize opportunities for employees that are able to use a water bottle to reduce the number of trips they have to make to the fountain, whether they're disabled or not. The technical requirements for the different fountains are found in section 602. And basically you must have both a wheelchair fountain that has a bubbler height of 36-inch high maximum and 27-inch minimum knee space with toe space below, along with some of the other features there on the slide I'm not going to cover in detail. The other fountain must be a standing user fountain, and the only requirement there is that the bubbler height be 38 to 43 inches high, which allows people that may have issues bending over due to a disability to utilize the drinking fountain. So while drinking fountains are not required to be provided by ADA, if they are provided, then they must be compliant, and you must provide those matched pairs somewhere on each floor level or secured area. Here's a good example. This is a building floor for a client that we have, and you can see the 2 drinking fountains shown on either end of the red arrow in the center. One drinking fountain is a wheelchair fountain and located in this the stair lobby outside of the mayor's office. And the other one is also a wheelchair fountain located outside the office in the city manager's corridor. And again, both of those are the same type. So first of all, they're not compliant for having not having a standing user fountain on that floor, but also both of these fountains are located in separate areas and have separate access. So to really make this comply, you would need to provide a standing and wheelchair user in both the public area as well as in the employee area. Drinking fountains should be located with an alcove, which we've already talked about, so they're not protruding objects. The 27-inch minimum knee space at the wheelchair fountain is the exact same limit for protrusions. So if you have a fountain that's 27¼ inches knee space, that's all the better for the wheelchair user, but it's now a protruding object if it's sticking out like the fountain on the bottom photograph in this slide. If it's installed precisely, you might only need to protect one pair of a matched pair, the higher one, but there are models that are cane detectable for standing users as well, so that you might not need that if it's not in an alcove, depending on the model. If you do need to protect the protruding fountain or pair of fountains, there's a lot of different things you can do. You can place some type of permanent cane detectable object around them, as shown here, whether it's mounted permanent benches on the right or some type of railing system, as shown here on the left. And those are cane detectable and protects them. Just make sure if you do something like this that you provide the required clear width of 30 inches for a frontal approach to all of the different fountains. Now on to some different rooms. Various public buildings have a wide variety of room types, so I'm going to only cover generic conference rooms, break rooms, and workout rooms today, but you may have others in your spaces. All rooms are required to meet the requirements regarding signage and doors and be on an accessible route. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to cover anything on signage and doors in today's presentation, but will in an upcoming webinar, perhaps even the next one that I do. All rooms that I'm going to talk about today, regardless of what they are also required to provide those compliant floor spaces that we talked about earlier, and a 60-inch or T-shaped turning space within that's required by 304. So conference rooms generally have similar elements found in most. Light switches, which are again are a common element in all rooms, are required to provide a clear space and be at a compliant height. As well as electrical outlets. If you provide electrical outlets that are available to employees or even the public in many spaces, at least one is required to provide a compliant clear space and be within the 15 to 48-inch reach height. And this is really much more important in today's society with all the rechargeable devices and mobile devices we have to charge. It's certainly something that you should look at, and you can see in the photograph here where there's a couple of different outlets on the wall. One of which may not be accessible because of the narrow space between the table and the wall, but the one on the left certainly is. Tables with seating need to be provided that have the 27-inch minimum knee space below for a wheelchair, so they could easily move that chair aside and put their wheelchair in that space. And they almost also have that toe space, and the working surface height must be between 28 and 34 inches. Oftentimes in conference rooms, we have those potential protruding objects with a wall-mounted television monitor or a projector of some type, and just ensure that those are protected. You can see the one on the wall here is protected by a movable object, but it's unlikely to be moved. You could certainly put it in the corner and serve the same function and protect it that way. Some conference rooms still have whiteboards, whether they're wall mounted like the one in the photograph here or within a cabinet. If it's in a cabinet, ensure that you have compliant operable parts. Sometimes those cabinets don't have handles at all. They're just a smooth wood, and you've got to be able to grip them with your fingernails to open them, and that cabinet's not a protrusion. Quite oftentimes those cabinets are mounted above 27 inches, and they protrude 5 or 6 inches into the walking space in the room. If you happen to have a speaking podium like you would have in a training room or even in some of your public meeting rooms, ensure that it has a compliant height working surface, again, at 28 to 34 inches. Sometimes an adjustable height model is very, very beneficial, and they come with those. These are much more commonly something that should be looked at in courtrooms, but again, that's a public thing that I've already talked about in the last webinar and is available on our YouTube page. That adjustable height of the podium is to provide a clear line of sight between the speaker and the audience. So if you have someone in a wheelchair that's presenting to the people in this room, they have a space not only to put their notes and take notes, but they also have a direct line of sight to their audience. So on to break rooms. Just to keep it easy, let's consider that we're talking about just a room with tables, maybe a television or some seating within it. So it's essentially a lot like some of the other common use rooms in a facility, and still needs to meet those requirements that are common in all the rooms that I've already mentioned for signs and doors and turning spaces and reach heights to outlets and switches and all those other things. If the space has appliances or sinks or a coffee station or other amenities within, there will be additional requirements, and I'll cover those in the kitchen and kitchenettes discussion, since those really apply there. Probably the most common additional requirement in a break room, assuming employees would typically eat on their breaks in those rooms, is again to provide a compliant surface, or in this case, a dining surface that complies with the requirements of 902 for clear space, and be 28 to 34 inches high to the top of that dining surface, and provide a minimum of 27 inches of knee space and regulated toe space below as well. So it's pretty rare that we have this as an issue in most break rooms, but there are some that we've reviewed that are entirely high top tables, which would not meet these requirements and would need to provide a compliant dining surface. A new requirement in the 2010 standards pertains to workout and exercise rooms. The requirements are not extensive, but they do require that at least one of every type of workout equipment or workout machine comply with the requirements of providing an adjacent clear space that is located on an accessible route. And I've got a couple of graphics here, including a picture of an unusually wide open workout room that we found. The clear spaces adjacent to equipment can be shared by more than one piece of equipment. So if you have, let's say, a treadmill and an elliptical adjacent to one another, they can share the same clear space. And that's usually something that is going to be done. You don't have to provide a clear space at every treadmill or every elliptical or every weight machine, but one of each type must have a compliant clear space. So quite often we see these exercise and weight rooms just packed with equipment, and it's really difficult for even a fully ambulatory person to move around, let alone someone that is using a mobility device or has some other type of ambulatory impairment. Okay, so now that we've covered some of those more boring rooms that don't really have a lot in them, let's get on to one of the most prevalent types of common use spaces, being toilet rooms and bathing facilities. The scoping provisions for 213 pertaining to toilet rooms and bathing facilities aren't extensive as it pertains to scoping, but the technical provisions that are referenced are certainly very, very significant. ADA standards tend to lump both toilet rooms and bathing facilities together in scoping, but does separate them out into technical provisions. And I'll do the same for the discussion today, even though quite oftentimes room with bathing facilities are typically in a larger room with toilet facilities, but not always. First requirement in scoping is that all restrooms in new construction must be compliant to meet all the requirements. So if you're a designer and you're designing a brand new facility, all your restrooms need to be compliant. You can't select and choose and say, I'm going to design, this one's going to be the accessible restroom and this one's not going to be accessible. You're not permitted to do that by the standards for new constructions. However, most of you are looking at existing buildings and looking at doing alterations, and there are certainly exceptions in the requirements to providing all 100% of your restrooms being accessible. And all of those exceptions have specific conditions that apply. And I can't go over every single one of them today, but I'll discuss some of the most common ones as we move through the presentation on this part. The exception that's probably most advantageous is where you cannot technically provide all the requirements of 603, is to provide either a unisex toilet or bathing room located in the same general area as the inaccessible ones. Now, in many employee spaces, the restrooms especially are nowhere near compliant, sometimes being just a toilet and a sink jammed into a small closet-sized room that often includes other equipment like a water heater or even a furnace, like in a a garage or maintenance facility or some type of area like that. I mean, the restrooms that we see in some of those types of facilities are certainly usable by the employees in those areas, but they don't meet the requirements. Regardless, if you can't make those restrooms fully comply due to technical infeasibility for whatever reason, you are still required to make the rooms as accessible as possible within the constraints you have. So you might not be able to make a restroom compliant for a wheelchair user, but you could make some improvements that would help others with other types of disabilities. At least one toilet compartment, which we have always called a toilet stall, must be accessible to a wheelchair and meet the various technical provisions. And if you have 6 or more toilets or combined toilets and urinals, you're also required to provide an additional stall that meets the requirements for an ambulatory accessible stall. If you have urinals in obviously men's rooms, the addition of urinals to the fixture count is something that's new to the 2010 standards. Section 213.3.3 notes that where there is more than one urinal, at least one must be accessible. So where you only have one, the 2010 standards don't require it to be compliant. The 1991 standards, the ADAG standards, required a minimum of one regardless of how many you had. And then the ADAG didn't add urinals to the fixture counts for ambulatory stalls, but the 2010 standards did. So there's all kinds of mixing and mingling. And the best thing that we can say is to look at your situation and make everything possible accessible to the extent possible, if it can be done without a lot of cost and effort. Toilet and bathing facilities are required to meet all the same requirements for signage. This is one area I will talk about signage briefly, with additional requirements and other recommendations to consider. We typically suggest that your signs include pictograms for gender and any other features within the space, such as showers, though it's technically not required. So if you have a restroom, it's always good to have the restroom requirements, but for showers or for areas that you have restrooms or bathing facilities that are not accessible, provide directional signage to the accessible rooms as stated in section 216.8. Obviously for employee common use restrooms, it's pretty easy during your orientation process for new employees to say, hey, the accessible restroom is down here and these other ones are not. So you can't do that with the public, and you're not allowed to do that with the public. So first, let's discuss toilet rooms, often referred to as either family restrooms or unisex or whatnot, but sometimes they are a matched pair for male and female. These rooms are required to meet all the requirements for signage and doors and clear spaces and whatnot. And these rooms are also required to have a latch or some type of other lock for privacy, since it's expected to be used only by one person or maybe a parent with a child. Within a toilet room, there's a number of components that have a standard that need to be met, including things like sinks and mirrors and toilets and whatnot. And like all rooms, toilet rooms are required to provide a turning space within that 60-inch diameter or the T turning space. Most of the requirements for toilet rooms also apply to the larger multi-user restrooms and toilet stalls or compartments, and requirements for some of the items I'll discuss in the multi-user restrooms, but I'm going to try to talk specifically about things that are unique to toilet rooms for single users. We talked about turning space. That turning space can be either a 60-inch diameter circle or a T-shaped area with the dimensions shown in the center graphic. Note that in some cases, the knee space below the sink may be used to attain the required dimensions for that turning area, and the clear spaces for turning room within the room are allowed to overlap other clear spaces and be within the door swing. Toilet rooms are required to meet all the clear space requirements for doors on both the push and pull side, which we didn't go over, but you can see here graphically where you need to have that ability for someone in a wheelchair to be able to get into or out of the room and have those clear spaces. Sometimes these non-compliant clear spaces, if they are present, can be corrected by removing a door closer if the side clearance on the push side is less than 12 inches, because you only require that 12 inches if the door has both a closer and a latch. Or you can reverse the door to swing from left to right or right to left or in and out, as long as it is allowable by all codes. Inside the room, you must also have a compliant 30 by 48-inch minimum clear space that is entirely outside of the door swing. That will allow the person inside to open the door or exit if the door opens out, and be able to exit the room. Probably the most common area of non-compliance we see is providing the required clear space adjacent to the toilet for a wheelchair. The 2010 standards require a 60-inch minimum distance from the toilet wall to the opposite side. The 91 standards required only 36 inches to the sink. So oftentimes sinks encroach into the space in older facilities that haven't been altered or renovated, and needs to be addressed when those spaces are altered. 36 inches really doesn't provide space for most mobility device users to maneuver for a transfer to the toilet. And the depth of the clear space at the toilet is required to be a minimum of 56 inches, with the full clear width and depth shown in yellow in the figure on this slide. Flush controls are required to be on the open side of the toilet, which can be fixed by installing auto flush controls if it happens to be on the wall side. And this is so the person that is in that clear space on the other side, and in this case, the left of the toilet, doesn't have to reach all the way across to flush. And again, those auto flush controls are a valuable way to cheaply and easily fix it. The height of the toilet seat is required to be 17 to 19 inches high and not include a spring, so it returns to an up position when you get off the seat. Grab bars are required on both the side and back wall. The top of the gripping surface of grab bars is required to be at 33 to 36 inches high, and both bars should be at the same or at least very similar height. The standards make installation of the bars very important, since if you use the minimum lengths required of 36 inches for the rear bar and 42 inches long for the side bar, it takes a very precise placement to get them installed properly. That 36-inch rear bar is required to be installed relative to the center line of the toilet, 12 inches to the wall side and 24 inches to the open side. And that side bar is required to be a maximum of 12 inches from the rear wall and extend a minimum of 54 inches from the rear wall. So that perfect installation is required. And for that reason, we typically try to suggest and do continue to strongly suggest that you consider specifying a 42-inch bar for the rear and a 48-inch for the side to give you that little bit of extra play for the contractor to install those. There is an exception to the length of the grab bar where it's adjacent to a sink that's been recessed to provide a clear space at the toilet. And you are allowed to have a bar that is 24 inches long, centered on the toilet if it's adjacent to a recessed sink. This can be a good option in paired rooms, like the one in the photo on, or the figure on the right, or if there's adjacent spaces that you can borrow from to recess, but you might not always have that ability. There is a requirement for a clear space of 12 inches above and 1.5 inches minimum below and at the ends of both of the grab bars. And often this is obstructed by various dispensers and trash cans and whatnot. And you can see here in the photograph, both bars are obstructed, one by the paper towel dispenser and one by the toilet paper dispenser. Grab bars are required to be between 1.25 and 2 inches in diameter if they're circular, or if they're not circular, they must have a perimeter of 4 to 4 and 4.8 inches, and the edges must be rounded if they're not circular. The distance from the wall to the inside of the bar is required to be an absolute 1 1/2 inches, no more or no less. If it's less, it might not allow someone that's falling the ability to get their hand in to catch themselves, or to provide a space for their arm to catch themselves if they can't use their hands. And if it's more than 1 1/2 inches, it might allow somebody's arm to go between the wall and the bar and cause serious injury or even break their arm during a fall. The center line of the toilet paper dispenser is required to be 7 to 9 inches in front of the toilet and be within the 15 to 48 inch reach range, but also outside of the grab bar clear area that I presented in the last slide. So that really limits where you can place that toilet paper dispenser. So for larger multi-user restrooms, the requirements I just presented for toilet rooms related to turning spaces and clear spaces and all the doors and signs and toilet and grab bars, they're all the same. So I'm not going to review them, but I will go into some of the differences and clarify what is unique to toilet compartments. Similarly, all the items I'm going to discuss now, such as sinks and mirrors and coat hooks and dispensers and whatnot, all have the same requirements in this space as well as the toilet rooms that I just talked about. But again, to avoid having to talk about everything twice, I'm just going to say what I just talked about applies here, and what I'm going to talk about here applies there in most cases. As the name implies, multi-user restrooms accommodate more than one person at a time and typically don't have a lock on the door. They often typically include multiple sinks and urinals and men's rooms and toilet compartments or stalls, sometimes quite large. At least one sink and one toilet compartment must meet the requirements for wheelchair accessibility. And if there's more than one urinal, as we talked about earlier, at least one of those urinals must also meet the standards for urinal height and whatnot that I'll go over here in a minute. I did want to briefly show you just a list of all the different items that have a standard that are commonly found in multi-user restrooms. With those in red bold text, having a number of items to measure or evaluate. For the entry door, it's not just measuring the door. There's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different things you need to measure for that door. So you can see there's a large number of items that could be non-compliant. And if you've reviewed compliance of a large multi-user restroom, like in a convention center or a baseball stadium like we have, you can appreciate how long it can take to perform your compliance evaluation. So obviously don't stress about all the details in this slide. I'll be covering all these in the upcoming slides, unless I already covered them in the toilet rooms section that I already have gone over. So let's start with the sink area. If you provide a mirror and it's over a sink or countertop, the bottom of the reflective surface is required to be no higher than 40 inches. If it's not over a countertop, the bottom must be no higher than 35 inches. So mirrors over the sink are a pretty common issue, with the easiest way to correct it to either add an additional mirror on a wall at 35-inch maximum height, or just lower the mirror. And sometimes it's easier said than done. But at least one of each type of dispenser or amenity in the room must be within reach ranges and provide a compliant clear space and have compliant operable parts. So things like paper towel dispensers are oftentimes quite high and located such that they're protruding objects. And so are hand dryers, quite oftentimes protruding objects. You can see in the photograph here in the mirror, the toilet seat cover dispenser is way too high and well above the 48-inch maximum height. So, and we talked a little bit earlier about the feminine product dispensers that are often not having the compliant hardware. Those are also quite oftentimes protruding objects. At least one of those sinks must have a compliant clear space and knee space below with a 34-inch maximum rim. It's not uncommon to have a countertop set at 34 inches and then put in a drop-in sink like shown in the upper photograph. And now you have a 34-inch high sink rim elevation, which is not compliant. So that's certainly something to consider when you're specifying the types of fixtures you're going to put in a restroom. Are you going to use a drop-in sink, or are you going to use a bottom mount, or is it going to be a flush countertop with an integrated sink into it? Ensure that the faucet controls are levers or paddles and not knobs that require grasping and twisting. If you have a faucet with a meter type dispenser where the water stays on for a period of time after you push it, it must allow the water to run for a minimum of 10 seconds, so you don't have to keep pushing it. Water supply and waste pipes below sinks are required to be insulated or otherwise protected to prevent contact. And if for some reason you have multiple sinks and not all of them are compliant, you need to ensure that you make one compliant. And if they're not all compliant, it's the easiest thing to do is just to put a ISA symbol at the sink or on the mirror at that sink. That's obvious to identify that as the accessible facility within the space. For men's restrooms, we talked a little bit earlier about urinals. If there's more than one, but again, we certainly urge you to make them all accessible if there is only one. Urinals are required to have the rim at a maximum height of 17 inches and project a minimum of 13.5 inches from the wall. And urinals are required to have clear spaces and reach ranges for their flush controls and compliant operable parts, as we've talked about ad infinitum today. So the clear width at the urinal must be 30 inches wide, but if the urinals in an alcove that's over 24 inches deep, like you might find if you put it between a wall and a stall partition, that clear width must be 36 inches. So let's focus now on toilet compartments or stalls. And I'm going to use these two terms interchangeable since they're really the same thing to most of us. Stalls are required to be a minimum of 60 inches wide, and the width or the depth is dependent on whether you have a floor mounted or a wall mounted toilet, with 56 inches for a wall hung water closet, and for a floor mount, it's 59 inches. Section 604.8.1.2 has a couple of different requirements. First, it requires that the stall door has got to be located on the wall or partition opposite the toilet wall. So if you're standing in the doorway, you should either have to look right or left to the toilet, not straight ahead, as shown in the photograph on the right of this slide. In the instance in this slide on the right, on the photograph, you cannot get a wheelchair in there and give them places to maneuver to get into the clear space to offload. This same section also requires a latch approach side of 42 inches minimum, and requires that the door opening be offset a maximum of 4 inches from the wall opposite the toilet, whether it's a front or side entry. Um, it's surprising how often this 4 inches is not met, and it essentially eliminates the offset of the toilet when the offset is done properly. So, and usually the uh, uh, fault of the contractor from doing a faulty or sloppy installation. So all you designers out there, you might be wise to protect your clients and utilize the detail of 604.8.1.2 to um, put on your standard details for toilet compartments. Stall entry doors are required to be self-closing with either a spring or gravity hinge and have compliant handles or pulls on both sides of the door, both inside and outside. The stall door opening must be 32-inch clear width, and the door must either swing out, or if it does swing in, it cannot encroach on the required width or depth of the stall. And we usually see this in swinging door when it's at the end stall. And that can be a great way to provide the required clear space because you might not have that in this limited space area. Toe clearance is required on both the front and at least one side of the toilet compartment to assist a wheelchair user inside to be able to turn. That toe space is required to be 9 inches high minimum and project a minimum of 6 inches beyond the outside of the wall. There's an exception to this requirement if the stall is oversized, so that you essentially integrate that 6 inches into the width and depth of the stall. The requirements inside the stall for toilet center line and seat height and all the things I've already talked about are the same as those for a toilet room. The only thing that might be unique within a toilet stall that we didn't talk about within the stall is that the coat hooks typically found on the back of the stall door, you can't begin to imagine how often those are at 60 inches or higher and really essentially unusable. And they need to be at 48-inch maximum height and should also be on the inside of the stall. Oddly enough, we do see a few installations where the coat hook for a person's coat or other belongings are put on the outside of the stall door, which isn't really a very secure place to put them for the person inside the stall. As I mentioned earlier, 213.3.1 of the scoping provisions requires that where you have 6 or more combined urinals and toilets, one additional stall must be provided that meets the requirements of 604.8.2 for ambulatory stalls. An ambulatory stall is one that can be used by persons that are able to walk with or without the assistance of a mobility device. And the requirements for ambulatory stalls for most of the items are identical to those for wheelchair stalls, but there are a few differences. Things that are identical include the clear spaces and the door handles on both sides and the outswinging door and the 32-inch clear width and whatnot. But for ambulatory stalls, the things that are unique and shown on the slide include that the depth must be 60 inches, regardless of the type of toilet mount that you have. The width of the stall must be between 35 and 37 inches exactly. If it's too narrow or too wide, it doesn't work very well. And the center line of the toilet's allowed to be between 17 and 19 inches instead of 16 to 18 inches, which is required in a wheelchair stall. Grab bars are required all the way on both sides, and they must meet the same requirements as the side grab bar in a standard toilet wheelchair accessible stall. So that wraps up restrooms. Let's move on to bathing facilities. As mentioned at the beginning of the toilet rooms discussion, the scoping provisions for 213 pertain to building bathing facilities are similar to those for toilet rooms, but they're not very plentiful and there are a lot more technical provisions that are referenced. So I'm not going to rehash all the requirements for those where they're the same as they are in toilet rooms. So if you have specific questions about bathtubs, I'm not going to cover those because they're pretty rare in municipal facilities, but they are fall under the provisions of bathing facilities as do showers. I'm going to focus on showers. So shower facilities, we're going to call them. So example facilities in common use areas that have showers might be in places like water and wastewater treatment plants or maintenance facilities or fire stations or police locker rooms. And the ADA standards require that where provided, a minimum of 1 shower facility must be compliant. Many individuals, including some designers, are under the false assumption that accessible facilities for firefighters or police officers or others that are physically required to do certain job functions and can't be disabled are not required to be accessible. And there's currently no exception for any type of employee facility that's common use. So ensure, particularly in new construction, but also in any alterations in any space, that you include showers. And certainly they may not be a high priority, but Again, that would depend on the facility. So where multi-user bathing rooms are provided, accessible unisex bathing rooms can't serve as a substitute, similar to what we talked about with restrooms for new construction. But in alterations, you do have some exceptions, particularly the one in exception 1, 213.2 that I talked about earlier. So you see the figure on this slide is for a single user combination toilet shower room, which could be male or female or unisex. And again, has to meet all the requirements for the toilet room that we've already gone over. There are two different types of showers, roll-in and transfer, and two different configurations for roll-in showers. From left to right in the photos, you have a standard roll-in shower. In the middle is an alternate roll-in shower, which has a short wall on the entry wall. And on the right is a transfer shower. All shower types have requirements for dimensions, seats, grab bars, and whatnot. And I'm going to review each one of those. So first, let's talk about roll-in showers. As the name implies, the roll-in shower includes a large enough area for a wheelchair to roll in and use. For a standard roll-in shower, the minimum dimensions and clear spaces outside are identical, being a 30-inch depth and a 60-inch width. All inside dimensions for all showers are to be measured at the center for all shower types. Note that the clear space outside is allowed to be encroached upon by a sink at one end, as long as it's not on the same end as either the controls or the seat if you provide it for a roll-in shower. If a seat's provided in a standard roll-in shower, it's often recommended but not required that the clear space be extended at least 12 inches beyond the seat as shown on the slide here. This provides a much better alignment for the wheelchair to the front of the seat for their transfer to the seat. For an alternate roll-in shower, and you can see here the entryway and the short stub wall on the entry wall, the minimum dimensions are larger, being 36-inch absolute depth, and that is an absolute depth, and 60-inch width, which is the minimum and not an absolute. The opening to the shower is also a minimum at 36 inches and must be on the long end of the shower. And these dimensions hold whether there's a seat or not within the shower. And you can see the dashed line showing where the shower seat goes for an alternate roll-in shower. Standard roll-in showers don't require a seat, but if there is no seat, there must be grab bars on all three interior walls. Grab bars must be located such that there's a 6-inch maximum from the adjacent wall to the end of the grab bars. With the specific requirements for the grab bars already discussed as part of the toilet stalls and toilet rooms as contained in section 609. I want to also note here that for showers, the controls are allowed to be within that 12-inch clear space above the grab bars, but they do have to be at least 1.5 inches above. And you can see here on the graphic on the right, the yellow area showing the 12-inch clear space and the small 1.5-inch area that is allowed to be within. If there is a seat in a standard roll-in shower, it must be a folding type and located on a side wall. There must be grab bars on the side wall opposite the seat and on the rear wall. The grab bars must be located again 6 inches maximum from the adjacent seat, except that the rear grab bar should not overlap the seat as shown here in the figure. You can see the outline of the seat. There should not be a grab bar behind or adjacent to the seat. For alternate roll-in showers, grab bars must be provided on the side wall opposite the entrance and on the rear wall, with again those grab bars being within 6 inches. If there's a seat provided, the grab bar again should not overlap the seat, and that's pretty clearly shown here in the photograph on the far right. Control location for standard roll-in showers without a seat can be provided on any wall as shown in the graphic. For standard roll-in showers with the seat, they are required to be on the rear wall adjacent to the seat and within 27 inches of that seat wall. The location of controls for alternate roll-in showers without a seat must be on the side wall opposite the entrance as shown in the graphic. But if you have a seat, they're allowed to be either on that same wall or on the back wall within the dimensions shown here on the slide. All roll-in showers require a vertical threshold height maximum of 1/2 inch beveled. Obviously, this is a roll-in, so a person in a wheelchair is going to potentially roll in here. But consider making those thresholds as small as possible, including use of a trench drain to try to make that a zero entry area if you possibly can. So now on quickly to transfer showers. As the name implies, transfer shower compartments are designed to have a user transfer from a wheelchair to the compartment. All transfer showers require a folding seat located on a sidewall that is opposite the controls. And this photo shows a pretty typical configuration for a compliant transfer shower. Transfer showers are required to be absolutely 36 inches wide and 36 inches deep, no more nor less, again, measured at the center point. The clear space outside of the transfer shower is required to be a minimum of 36 inches deep and 48 inches wide, with 12 inches of that width extending beyond the seat wall, as I discussed previously, as an option, but not a requirement for a standard roll-in shower with the seat. This, again, assists with aligning the wheelchair to the front of the seat for that transfer. Controls for transfer showers must be on the sidewall opposite the seat and located within the area 15 inches toward the entry from the center line of the seat, between 38 and 48 inches high. Grab bars, again, are required to be provided on both the control wall and the rear wall to 18 inches from the control wall, essentially in an L configuration. And this is an area where you may have a slight overlap between the rear grab bar and an L-shaped seat, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Thresholds for transfer showers are allowed to be up to 1/2 inch vertical with no beveling required. And you might wonder why this is so stringent, since people are offloading. But for persons that have no use of their legs, a higher threshold might catch their feet as they drag themselves across to transfer. So it's pretty important to meet this standard so that they are able to transfer easily without that obstruction. A common error we see in a lot of different showers, but especially transfer showers, is placement of grab bars on the seat wall. Again, this would make taking a shower very uncomfortable, and there should never, ever, regardless of the type of shower that you're designing or altering, should never be a grab bar on a wall with the seat. Quickly on some of the requirements for showers, regardless of type. Spray units, if you provide a removable spray unit, it must be allowed to be usable in a fixed position as shown on the right, but it can also be taken off. If the fixed position includes an adjustable bar, you should try to ensure that the spray unit can't be moved higher than 48 inches. The hose length should be 59 inches minimum and have a separate water control also. And again, the handheld spray is not a requirement, but must meet the standards if you provide it. I already mentioned it, but the requirements for grab bars and showers are identical to those in toilet rooms and toilet compartments. So let's talk a little detail about shower seats as we're getting close to wrapping up here. We've mentioned seats in earlier slides, which are required for all transfer showers and are an option for both type of roll-in showers. The technical provisions for shower and bathtub seats are in section 610 and can be either rectangular or L-shaped. Regardless of whether they're rectangular or L-shaped, the top of the seat must be between 17 and 19 inches high, and the seat must be able to support a minimum of 250 pounds of force to any part of the seat, mount, or wall. Rectangular seats must be 15 to 16 inches from the rear wall, as shown in the figure here, and be the full depth of the compartment to within 1/2 inch of the rear and 3 inches to the front of the compartment. The gap along the wall behind the seat can't exceed 2.5 inches. L-shaped seats front edge must be, again, between 15 and 16 inches from the rear wall, with the L portion being 22 to 23 inches from the rear wall, again, as shown in figure 610.3.2. The L part of the shape of the seat must be 14 to 15 inches from the rear wall. And again, similarly with the rectangular seat, the seat must be within 1 and 1/2 inches of the rear and 3 inches of the front of the compartment, and the gap in the wall behind the seat can't exceed 2.5 inches. So dressing, fitting, and locker rooms are addressed in the scoping provisions of section 222 and requires that 5% with a minimum of 1 of all dressing, fitting, and locker rooms be compliant with 803. Quite oftentimes in municipal facilities, these include primarily locker rooms that are integrated into spaces with restrooms and showers. But 803 also requires a bench that complies with the technical provisions of 903 and requirements for coat hooks and storage shelves. Section 225 of scoping, entitled Storage, requires 5% of lockers to comply with technical provisions of 811, which again just requires a clear space at accessible lockers and coat hooks and shelf requirements for reach ranges and operable parts. This is an area where I think you need to use some discretion in determining compliance. Obviously, there is an intent to provide accessible lockers and benches in areas where people would be expected to change clothes. If integrated into a shower room, you might have 2 different changing areas needing to meet the standards with benches and storage devices, one at the shower area and one at the lockers. And while this may exceed the standards, you should consider how your employees use those different spaces. Would they typically change clothes at the lockers if they didn't shower? If so, then they would should have an accessible bench at the lockers. But also, if they would undress and dress at the shower, again, you would need to provide that. So again, the area that they would be dressing would be areas that you would want to provide those types of amenities. And in this photo, you see a good example of a compliant bench adjacent to a locker, though the bench doesn't have a compliant clear space in the correct location. Technical requirements for benches and changing in dressing rooms are found in section 903, and it essentially requires a clear space at the end parallel to the short axis as shown in the upper figure on the slide. And the upper figure also shows the minimum 42-inch length required, as well as the 20 to 24-inch depth. Figure 903.4 displays graphically the requirements for back support, being that it must extend from a maximum of 2 inches above the seat to a minimum of 18 inches above and have a gap of 2.5-inch maximum at the back. And that can also be a wall. It doesn't necessarily have to be a back to a seat if you mount the bench to a wall. And again, the top of the bench seats, just like shower benches and toilet seats, are required to be between 17 and 19 inches high. Quite often we see benches placed between rows of lockers, which clearly don't meet the dimensional requirements for accessible benches. They don't have back support, and it obstructs access to the lockers. Benches like the one shown can typically be fixed by either modifying them to relocate a portion and find a place within the space to provide a compliant locker and a bench. But again, it really depends on each individual space. The last types of employee spaces I want to discuss are break rooms and kitchens and kitchenettes. Sometimes the break room and kitchen area are within the same space, but often there are multiple kitchenettes in the building. And I already talked a little bit about break rooms, but now I'm going to talk about break rooms with appliances and whatnot. So for example, there's often a large number of small kitchenette areas scattered throughout buildings, like in hallways or conference rooms that maybe it's just a coffee station and quite oftentimes has a sink. It's important to note that the standards don't define kitchen or kitchenette, but they kind of use them both interchangeably for some unknown reason. I'm kind of hoping that they clarify that in any updates. Personally, I tend to differentiate the two by saying that a kitchen includes a cooking device like a stove or a cooktop or an oven, and a kitchenette is everything else, whether it has a sink or not. So when I'm using the terms kitchen and kitchenette, that's really what I'm using them for. Even though a kitchenette, you might have a microwave or a toaster or something like that, it's not technically a cooking device, which kicks in a bunch of different requirements. And I'm going to go over here in a minute. Access is required for common use kitchens, but the requirements in work area kitchens identical to other work areas. So you can see here in a photograph, this is a large work kitchen. This would be obviously a Title III private chef's kitchen. I don't know too many public kitchens that are like this, but those types of kitchens just must meet the requirements for approach, entry, and exit, and egress. And if it's 1,000 square feet, and yada yada yada, we've already talked about. So I'm not going to be talking about residential kitchens or those in motel guest rooms and whatnot that have additional requirements. But if you do design those facilities, know that there are additional requirements to those that I'm going to be presenting for those spaces. The scoping provisions of 212 address kitchens and kitchenettes as well as sinks in those spaces. 212.2 simply states that kitchens and kitchenettes are required to comply with the technical provisions of 804, which I'll cover here in a minute. And 212.3 requires that where there are sinks, except mop or service sinks, 5%, but at least one must comply with the technical provisions of 606, which is a new requirement for these spaces in the 2010 standards. The 1991 standards requirements for sinks applied only in restrooms. So in the photograph here, you can see we have a little kitchenette in a hallway that's just a little nook, and it has a sink. Well, that sink is in a unique space and would need to be compliant, and I'll explain here in just a minute how often they are not. So within the kitchen or kitchenette, the elements that are often present and regulated include things like sinks and cooking devices and appliances and storage devices, and all the building blocks items that we've talked about numerous times and in previous presentations are going to apply, including things like clear spaces and the types and height of operable parts. So let's talk about kitchen layouts real quickly. There are two types of kitchen layouts, one being pass-through or U-shaped. And you see here graphically a pass-through kitchen, which has amenities on opposing parallel walls. It requires a minimum clear space of 40 inches between the two sides and must have both an entry and an exit at the ends. The standards do have an exception to this 40 inches, as well as in U-shaped kitchen 60-inch requirement if there's not a cooking device, but this is certainly somewhere that you might want to consider exceeding the requirements because a wheelchair user would never be able to get through if it was less. U-shaped kitchens are enclosed on 3 sides and require a 60-inch clear width. Again, that's that turning space for a wheelchair user. And the graphics here have both a sink and a cooking device, but that exception does apply if there's not a cooking device. So it would really technically only require a 36-inch width. But again, a wheelchair user would never be able to get in there, use that, and be able to turn and get out. So consider exceeding it and providing the 60 inches regardless of whether there's a cooking device or not. 804.4 addresses sinks and directs you to section 606 of the standards, which requires that sinks provide a clear space for the forward approach, knee and toe clearance, compliant faucet controls, and that the sink rim again is 34 inches high maximum, as we talked about in restroom sinks. So quite oftentimes in non-restroom areas, break rooms and kitchens and kitchenettes, we see sink rims that are 36 inches or even higher, since the standard height of most base cabinets with a countertop is going to establish a 36-inch countertop. And if you use a drop-in sink, that might even add to that. So you can see on the bottom picture on this slide, they actually use a customized model for the base cabinet for the sink, and that sink is actually at 34 inches and does comply. Here you see a couple options for sinks in kitchens with a cooking device. Since a cooking device kicks in the requirement for a kitchen to have knee space below the sink. If you do not have a cooking device like a stove or an oven or a cooktop, you are not required to provide knee space below, although again, it's not a bad idea to exceed the requirements and standards to provide that. And that knee space below can either be open or, like in the photograph on the right, the figure on the right, and showing the yellow clear space and knee space below the sink, be in a cabinet with compliant handles that have doors that open and close. Operable parts of all the different amenities within a kitchen or kitchenette should be raised or flush and not recessed. All those elements are required to be within all the reach ranges and have the clear spaces that we've talked about in a number of different slides. So on to some of the appliances. All appliances must provide an adjacent clear space with the location required depending on the type of that clear space. All controls for appliances must be operable with a closed fist and be within reach ranges, as we talked about, except as noted on the slide for doors and latching devices and bottom hinge doors like you might have on an oven. So dishwashers require a clear space adjacent to the door when it opens to allow someone in a wheelchair to assist in loading and unloading the dishwasher, and that clear space shown in yellow here. A parallel space is permitted for cooking appliances, and that parallel space should be centered on the appliance. Though it's uncommon, if you do provide a cooktop on a counter, it must have knee and toe space below and be insulated, so the person using it, maybe in a wheelchair, doesn't feel their legs, has no feeling in their legs, wouldn't be burned and not realize it until it's too late. For ovens, there must be a clear space on one side for a bottom hinged door type, like is most common. And probably the biggest commonly observed non-compliant issue for stoves and ovens is that all controls are required to be on the front panel. So someone isn't required to reach over a potentially hot burner or a hot stove to operate the controls. And you can see here, this typical stove that you would find does not meet the requirements for having all the cooking devices on the front panel and not require someone to reach over a hot stove or cooktop. Combination refrigerators and freezers are required to have at least 50% of the freezer space at a maximum of 54 inches above the floor. And the clear floor space or ground space should be positioned for a parallel approach and allow for someone to actually get to that door. And I apologize about the blurry picture, but this is the best example of a refrigerator freezer that I have that has the door opening the wrong direction. So you can imagine someone in a wheelchair trying to open that refrigerator door on themselves and get into it. It would be very difficult for them. This is also a pretty large refrigerator and does not have 50% of the freezer space below 54 inches. So quite oftentimes bottom freezers or side-by-side refrigerator freezers might be a better option. 804.5 addresses requirements for storage. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but essentially 50% of all the shelf space is required to be accessible. And you can see here where I've highlighted on the figure on the bottom left in red, all the shelf space that is below 15 inches or above 48 inches, and the shelf and drawer space that is above 15 but below 48 inches and is compliant. I think it's more important to ensure that any items that you have are all located such that some of all kinds are within the reach ranges. It doesn't do you any good to have compliant cabinets, but still put some unique items above or below reach ranges. So now that we've covered all these regulated spaces, there may be others in your facilities. How do you prioritize those improvements as we wrap up here? Since I doubt anyone has a pile of money sitting there waiting to be used for something, and you're using my webinar to help you figure that out. Some things are pretty obvious, such as, in the photograph here, we've got stairs going up to a restroom marked as accessible with the ISA on the door. If that's an employee restroom in a break area, it's probably pretty important to fix that and make that accessible. But some other things to consider would be to determine the impact that non-compliance has on the users of those spaces. We talked about having a shower room that's used strictly by firefighters and patrol police officers that can't do their job with a serious mobility impairment. While technically those shower facilities must be compliant, it's probably not a very high priority compared to many other things that you're going to have in your capital improvement program. But if you have a shower space that's open to all employees that could do their jobs with a wheelchair, then those certainly raise a little bit higher in the priority system. Most of your public spaces are going to be a higher priority than almost any of your employee spaces. But again, you need to look at those on a case-by-case basis and ensure that you have at least the compliant parking and accessible entrances and routes to and from the entrances and routes within the building. You might even want to consider putting in an online survey for employees in your municipality to ask them what barriers they have to access, particularly if they have a disability. Because some employees that even don't have a qualifying disability might have issues. For example, if they're short, they might have issues with reaching some items in a kitchen cabinet or whatnot, and just are afraid to bring that to someone's attention. So, knowledge is power. So the more you know what issues are out there, the easier you are able to make good decisions on what corrections to make first and which ones can be delayed. Because they're more impacting or costly. And obviously, as the cartoon here on the slide shows, not everything can be a high priority. Obviously, you're going to have some things that are really high priority, but deciding how to implement your capital improvements, including projects specifically for accessibility, is really a long process that requires a lot of careful budgeting and planning and coordination with other facility improvements. The other thing that you also have to your advantage for employee common use areas is the ability to provide what's called reasonable accommodation. So again, it's going to depend on how non-compliant some of those areas are, but knowing the fact that you have employees and what employees are going to need certain accommodations to do their essential job functions is really powerful. And some communities actually have a disability accommodation request form like the one shown here on this slide. Obviously, you can make some pretty serious decisions about what accessibility needs are there. If someone says that this or this or this or this restroom isn't accessible and it's the one I use. So some things that you could do for accommodation would be things like assigning parking to a door closer to a work area, or relocate a person's workspace to be closer to an accessible restroom or the entryway to their work area, so they don't have to work through 50 or 60 cubicles to get to their area in the back of that large 1,000 square foot area. Or they can tell you also what amenities and spaces they have issues accessing, and allow you to focus on things that are more cost efficient in the room. So that reasonable accommodation policy really should be considered included in personnel policy manuals. Some clients have it, many of them don't. And we almost always recommend that be considered as a part of the program review that we do during our transition plan projects, including some that we've done for many of the people on this webinar. So again, as we're wrapping up, a couple of resources for you to be familiar with. First is the Department of Justice at ada.gov. This is a great place to get technical information, including copies of the ADA standards. The U.S. Access Board at access-board.gov. Here you can get a copy of the right-of-way standards if you're have a requirement to be in charge of right-of-way facilities like sidewalks and curb ramps. But there's also all kinds of other good information on both of those sites rather than just downloading documents. The ADA National Network includes a number of great resources, and they're at accessibilityonline.org. And if you go there, they have a lot of webinars on very specific topics as it relates to accessibility and requirements for the standards. And you also see there a link to a comparison of the 91 and 2010 standards, if that's something that is of interest to you. So with that, as I suspected, I went a little bit longer than normal. I'm never at a loss for words, those of you that know me well. But I won't have time to present on any of the parking doors or sign stuff. But again, we're going to provide a PDF of this presentation, and those slides will be on that PDF, and we will present on those topics, specifically doors and signs, in a future upcoming presentation. So I only see one question in the Q&A, but if you have others, as I'm going through this, please type it in and I'll stay here and try to get to it as much as I can. If it's a longer question that you don't feel like typing in, or one that requires additional information or photographs, please feel free to discuss those online with me, or via either email or telephone. So the only question we have is, what's the requirement for vertical grab bars? Vertical grab bars are a new requirement in the building code and are not specifically addressed as a requirement in the ADA standards. However, all standards apply when you do an alteration. So if you go, or in a new construction. So if you go in and do an alteration within a toilet stall or a toilet room for wheelchair accessibility, the horizontal grab bars on the side and rear walls are a requirement of ADA, and the building code has an additional requirement for a vertical grab bar. It's under discussion now that should be added in the next version of the ADA standards, and we'll see if that actually is going to be the case or not. But that vertical grab bar is not a requirement for ADA, although it certainly does assist individuals with standing and sitting if they're able to be ambulatory. So I don't see any other questions, and I've answered that one fairly well. So so in closing, I would like to acknowledge both the U.S. Access Board staff. I interact with them pretty regularly and ask them questions and bounce things off of them. They allowed me to use their photographs and a number of the figures in today's webinar, and they often present on the ADA National Network, so I would encourage you to register for that. We also have DLZ's YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and search DLZ Corporation, we should show up pretty prominently. And if you click on the videos link, you'll see all the different videos that have been done by DLZ staff, including all the different ADA webinars that I've done. Again, this is the 4th in the series, and I've done a couple of others that were outside of the series that are all on there. But if you have any additional questions, my contact information there by email, feel free to forward those on, and I'll see what I can do to help you out. Don't hesitate to send those. And there may or may not be an online survey sent to you asking about today's webinar, but if there's any topics of interest that you have that you would like to see discussed or presented at a future ADA accessibility webinar, please feel free to send those on to us. You know, our goal here is to educate everyone on the ADA and the requirements for accessibility because it's the right thing to do. But there's also obviously that obligation. So again, I welcome those in that input, and please feel free to forward it on. So I don't see any additional questions. So if there are no other questions, I thank you all for attending, and hope to have you at a future webinar on ADA or other things that DLZ has, and wish you all a great rest of your day and week, and a great holiday season. So thanks again.